Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my July 2025 AM Reading Finale video. Now that we're into the second week of August, it feels like a good time to wrap things up. This was an unusual, booktube AM reading month for me because I went ahead and I distilled things down to 2 videos where I usually make 3 videos. And in fact, I'm not going to, in this video, be reading from Boulevard because I usually open these videos by reading a short story from a literary magazine. But instead, I read all 3 of my July short stories in my last AM reading video where I was on my cruise. And that was a really fun video to do, and I will link that down below. I also think I'm going to go ahead and not do as many AM reading videos for the next 2 months as well. In fact, I'm only going to do 1 reading wrap-up. So my next one will probably be like at the beginning of September to wrap up all of August because I am reading for the BookTube Prize and I have a deadline for that, and I have other reading and writing related deadlines and BookTube content relating deadlines I want to meet. So I figured I had to, adjust my schedule a little bit. And other than that, I'll just go ahead and say that my July literary newsletter is now live, so I'll link to that down below. This contains snippets from the Goodreads reviews I wrote for everything I read in July, and I also have literary news that caught my attention, and a book pick, and my favorite book quote, etc. So check that out down below. But otherwise, I'll be talking about a fair amount of those books right here, right now. Hopefully in a quick sort of overview sort of way, not like too rambly or anything. We shall see. So the first book I want to talk about, this is kind of a wrap-up from where I left things off in the last AM reading video, but this is my audiobook, or it was, of The Ragpicker King by Cassandra Clare, which has been returned now to the library, and you can see what I'm actually listening to now down below. But anyway, The Ragpicker King is book 2 in Clare's Castellane epic fantasy series, and I very much enjoyed it. It was my favorite read of the month, actually. This book continued on from where the last one left off. In the last book, we have an epic cast of characters. We're primarily following characters who interact on the hill of Castellane. That would be where the royals live. They do have like a king and queen and prince, but they also have like royal families who handle charters of like economy stuff. You know, it's based off of medieval Venice. But we also do have some characters who aren't part of the royalty, and one of the major subgroups are called the Ashkar, and they are based off of Jewish culture, and they live in the Salt, which is based in part on the ghetto where the Venetian Jews would have lived in a semi-similar society, and are main characters anyway. Well, neither of them are royalty. One of them is the sword catcher from the first book called Sword Catcher, called Kel. He is a bodyguard and body double for the prince. And then the other main character we follow is Lynn, who is an Ashkar physician, and she gets kind of more embroiled with the royals, especially because her grandfather is an advisor to them. But anyway, we open up book 2. There had been an assassination and like a massacre, really, in the end of the last book. And so Kel is actually working with the Ragpicker King, who is basically the leader of the underground life in the city of Castellane. He's working with him to try to figure out who did this. And he's actually keeping it a secret from Connor, which comes back ultimately to bite him. But at the time, you know, he's a character, I think, you know, who very much is somebody who loves Connor, and this feels like maybe the strongest relationship in the book, and so it's a misguided thing to keep the secret from him, but I think he just feels like compelled to kind of control everything until he knows what's really going on. And then Lynn, meanwhile, has gone ahead and announced herself as the Goddess Reborn, which is sort of a messianic figure for her people that's supposed to lead them out of exile. So the Exilarch, which is based off of a real Jewish Babylonian figure, that person lives on the road in this story, and he comes to Castellane, to the Salt, to sort of test Lynn's mettle, although that kind of takes place near the end of the story. And with that, I think what Clare is actually asking is something that starts out kind of as a lie, because Lynn kind of manipulates situations, and what she really wants to do by saying she's the Goddess Reborn is to be able to have the power to help her friend who is dying. But in fact, even though she's not actually this figure, it's like as she takes on the mantle, maybe it becomes more true in a way. So I find that kind of interesting. And it also, because it's fantasy, this is embroiled with the fact that there's like magic that is on the outskirts of society, but maybe there might be ways to reclaim it. There's an antagonistic group of people, who are hateful and vengeful, who want to reclaim it. And hopefully our main characters might instead we do have a lot of like interstitiary chapters of like lots of secondary characters, lots of subplots. Once again, this world just feels really rich and the characters have lots of motivations. There's a lot of like surprise identities, but they don't feel like gotcha moments. It's just because understanding that people have different associations and motivations about, what drives them. So, I mean, I just think Clare is firing on all cylinders. I also do love the Jewish commentary. When it comes to Jewish fantasy, a lot of Jewish fantasy books have a Jewish coded character, but she doesn't or he doesn't exist within that Jewish world. And at least in this book, even though Lynn is often on the hill, there is still a society that she's part of that, is very based in a lot of Jewish history and ideas. So I'm really enjoying that as well. So yes, I am very excited to, I think, complete the series, I assume, with the last book, whenever it comes out. Next, I read a short story collection, Hardly Children, by Laura Adamczyk. This was one of my top of the Goodreads books. It's been on my Goodreads TBR so long, it went all the way up to the top, and I wanted to shave it off. And I enjoyed this collection. I'm kind of up and down with short story collections. So many of them turn out to be surrealist, and I don't really like that sort of style, but these stories were grounded enough in reality that I could follow them. The subject matter maybe is questionably taboo. Children feature within a lot of the stories, and a lot of times they're sexualized by the author, talking about like female sexuality on the cusp of adolescence, like especially in two stories about sisters, three sisters existing in two stories having to do with growing up. And I feel like there's a visceral quality to Adamczyk's confidence with her narrators, which could turn people off if they're, espousing controversial opinions or living in controversial worlds. Like another character, a adult character in a story where children from lesser means are being kidnapped or abducted, and society is saying they're basically less than and shrugging and turning the other cheek. And it's obvious this character is absorbed in the story but isn't able to actually publicly talk about it with anyone. There's stories where adults kind of act childlike or relate to other adults in childlike ways. Like she's trying to leave a relationship where she's sort of mocking her innocent type of adult boyfriend, calling him the virgin and that sort of thing. So yeah, I like those stories. I mean, even if they were somewhat uncomfortable sometimes, there were a couple of stories in here where it was more surrealist, like let's write about a metaphor, and those ones didn't work for me as well. But the ones that did, I enjoyed or was piqued by as I read them. Next, I have The Thinking Heart, Essays on Israel and Palestine by David Grossman, one of my anticipated releases of the year. A very slim collection. It was kind of half of these, I think, were written before October 7th, or at least half, maybe more than half, actually. And then a couple were written after October 7th. They all reference Israel's relationship with Palestinians. There's essays in here that Grossman gave over the years, like a span of, I think, almost 10 years, where he talks about, like, Netanyahu's policies, before October 7th that have been created rifts and have been questionable when it comes to democracy, like what he's been trying to do with the Supreme Court in Israel. He talks about the occupation and the cost on Israelis and Palestinians. He has an essay in here he gave when he got an honorary degree at Hebrew University, where I liked it because he talked a bit about Ora from To the End of the Land, which is, I think, his most famous novel, and that's the one that so far, it's my favorite by far. And so he talked about trying to get into her skin, and it was almost like, trying to embrace the idea of identifying with someone different than you, like in his way, it's because she's a woman. But also that kind of segued into him talking about the Bedouins who had lived in the area before the university. And then they're in the post-October 7th stuff. Actually, most of these are essays. And I guess in a way, I guess I docked a star thinking, well, these are kind of fleeting or whatever. But the thing that really, struck me maybe the most viscerally would be a poem he wrote, which I think unnervingly talks about the Israeli psyche post-October 7th and how difficult it is for them to engage with things beyond the trauma, and just how, entrenched everyone is in the deaths and the torture of October 7th, the hostages, some of whom remain in captivity, and how connected, Israel's a small country, how connected people are to the hostages. I mean, speaking as an American Jew, there's people in my community in Washington, D.C., at my synagogue, the hostages and the dead are their family and are their friends. And so we're all very connected. So anyway, I think in that he was trying to explain the unnerving psyche they're in. But a lot of these also do try to take a deeper confrontational look, I think, at the Palestinians and their place within society, and the cost, the very serious cost of what occupation and second-class citizenship and that sort of thing has cost. For some lighter fare, I read The Matzo Ball by Jean Meltzer as my page 112 tag pick. This has been on my shelves for a while, and it's a very buzzy book. I think in terms of Jewish romance, Jean Meltzer is kind of the queen now, and she also runs a Jewish Joy book subscription and other things having to do with Jewish joy. And I've been trying to read more Jewish romance, but I think I have trouble with contemporary romance in general. It annoys me too much because I think I take myself too seriously for this genre, perhaps. But anyway, in this story, we're following a Jewish Christmas romance writer. She's in the closet writing Christmas romance novels, and she is the daughter of a renowned rabbi. Her name is Rachel Rubenstein Goldblatt. Of course, she writes under a pen name. And so to be outed as someone who writes who writes Christmas romance novels, it would actually cause a bit of a ruckus in the community. Is this something that, the daughter of, one of the most esteemed Jewish rabbis and leaders should be doing? And also she's living with chronic illness. I feel like, in most romance novels, especially the main character has to have something that, makes them think I can't be loved and I can't, tell my truth and be part of society. And so that's hers. Meanwhile, things are going great, even though she doesn't, tell her community what she's doing. But in her publishing world, they, want something more diverse. They're leaning into diversity, and they want a Hanukkah novel. And that freaks Rachel out because, she writes the Christmas romances to be escapist, and Hanukkah is not escapist to her, and she doesn't know how to do it. But she finds out there's, this fancy schmancy Jewish party coming up called the Matzo Ball that is at the final night of Hanukkah, and it celebrates Hanukkah. But the main person who is organizing it is her camp archenemy Jacob Greenberg. And this is where I really started to get annoyed because both characters are almost 30 and they're holding grudges against each other for an 8-week relationship when they were 12. And I just really thought, well, obviously neither of these people are mature enough to have adult relationships as it is. You have to get over what happened before bar mitzvah age. Come on. I mean, anyway, that I think even other people, I think that bothered them a little. That conflict felt a little concerning. Anyway, well, when it comes to Jacob, he is a bit of a prankster, and that ties into something more foundational that happened when he was about 12, and that his mother started to get sick and his father left the family. And ultimately, after this camp experience, he went with his mother to live for the rest of his life in Paris, and he's back to New York, where the story takes place for the first time in decades, and is having Shabbat dinner with Rachel's family, and she's trying to wheedle a ticket out of him, and the only way she can really get one by this point is to do some volunteer work, and things go awry there because he's being a prankster and a jokester, and he doesn't know until she's very ill that she has this chronic fatigue syndrome. And then, of course, because he's ultra rich, the way to, get into her good spot and her heart is to be this caretaker who hires this live-in maid and personal assistant for her. And this also makes me think about how all romance seems to be a fantasy in a way, because everybody's always dreaming about somebody with money, because money is what provides that fairy tale life where you can have 24/7 care, or you know, more luxurious things perhaps as well. Although I think the 24/7 care is pretty luxurious for most of us. So I don't know, it makes me arch my eyebrow, because then it's less about the relationship and more about capitalism. Not to say that these things aren't, you know, amazing, but, you know, should love be about more than that too? But anyway, romances are fairy tales, and maybe I should be cool with that. And maybe I'd enjoy it in like a non-contemporary setting, you know, where I have a little more distance myself from, you know, what's going on. So those are my general thoughts. I did enjoy, ultimately, once we got past, you know, the 12-year-old nonsense or whatever, and they started to, you know, interact with each other in the present as adults, I started to get on board with this story. You know, some things were better than others, but ultimately, you know, and you know where this is ending, and it's nice to think, you know, somebody who thinks she can't, you know, be part of the world and get love, you know, finds love and some acceptance even when she's outed as a, you know, a Christmas romance writer. And then Jacob is able to find a loving relationship and realize that, you know, just because, you know, his father was an asshole, that, you know, he can still trust other people and, you know, move on in his adult life. So overall, I guess I enjoyed this book well enough, although I still feel like it's maybe my least favorite read of the month. And anyway. But I'm not ready to let Jewish romance go, and I still have a lot that's contemporary on my TBR, so I guess we'll see what happens next in this journey of mine. Next, for the most hyped book on my list, probably in the world at large and for myself personally, I finally read Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. This is her second Hunger Games prequel, where she's talking about the games that Haymitch was in, the second Quarter Quell, the 50th Hunger Games. But more broadly, she's talking about governance and how like the power of the many who submit to the governance or the control of the few. And she, of course, is as always talking a fair bit about propaganda. And I'm struggling because I absolutely adore top-notch. Hunger Games is the series, the hill I'll die on. And this one, to me, you know, wasn't as good. I mean, I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, but it was not like the others for me. I think I don't feel like I was on the same page as much with Suzanne Collins. Maybe I finally have to admit to myself that I don't like or understand philosophy. The whole idea of, like, you know, governance and why people submit to the governance of the few, I don't know. I don't quite jive with it, I think, like, just broadly speaking. And then in the story, I don't really think it came together either. When it comes to, like, a fascist society like Panem, people bow to being governed by the few because the few are the ones who own the guns and the means of transportation and that sort of thing. I mean, the district citizens in the Hunger Games are famously kept apart from each other and not allowed to travel. And really the only time that people from different areas even see each other is in the Hunger Games. So for me, why it takes a while to, like, not submit to this form of fascism is because it takes a while to build up a rebellion that will actually stand a chance of winning. And that's what I like a lot about this book, because in this book we're seeing some, like, burgeoning, like, activities that start the rebellion and start the alliances that will bring us forward so that a few decades later in Mockingjay the rebellion could actually succeed. But those sorts of things have to be, you know, built up first. They can't just happen. So that's what I really did like that about this book. So Haymitch is, well, reaped in a sense, and he does go to the Hunger Games, and because of some of his actions, like his more defiant actions, he is approached by Beatty and Plutarch to, you know, help with, you know, what they want really in this time and place is to try to see if they could take down the arena, which is what they are ultimately able to do in the second Quarter Quell. That's what Katniss, with the help of others, is able to do. In this case, you know, spoiler alert, it doesn't work, not 100%, and the Capitol remains in control. But this is really the beginning of alliances and the beginning of trying to bring down the system. And I enjoyed that part, and I enjoyed getting to see these characters, you know, in an earlier part of their, you know, iteration as rebellious people. For Haymitch, he's 16, and unlike Katniss or Corio, who's Snow, you know, from the previous prequel, you know, he's not someone from a traumatized background, and I feel like this story isn't about him learning anything transcendent. I mean, Haymitch comes from a poor background, but he's mostly in a loving environment. He has friends and family who count on him and that support him. And I guess in general, I guess his MO is, well, this is just always the way it will be. So the lesson he kind of learns in this is, no, I can fight back, which he attempts to do in the arena. Then, when that does ultimately fail and Snow takes horrible vengeance against him, the story ends with him basically in stasis and in like a depressing state, and it doesn't feel complete. And in fact, Collins uses an epilogue to, sort of complete his arc, and it ties into, his story in the original trilogy, because I feel like in general, maybe his story doesn't feel complete. In that way, maybe it feels fan servicey to visit him in this time and place. And I kind of feel like to actually explore the ideas of propaganda and of governance, well, especially of governance, it would have been better to go with like Plutarch, or if we were to go with like a non-capital character, then it would be District 1 or District 2, because those people in those districts are more aligned with capital values. So it would be, they're the ones who actually eat up the propaganda more. I don't think we've ever met a character, not one single character in 12, who actually believes the propaganda. The only thing they might believe is they can't make a difference against it. But nobody thinks that the Capitol are like actually looking out for them, or that the Hunger Games are anything, moral or necessary or like needed vengeance. Nobody believes that. Nobody is happy with, being oppressed at home. And in fact, characters, including in this novel, do, work against it in several ways, trying to fight back in small ways against the peacekeepers and against production and that sort of thing. I did enjoy the novel because the characters were fun, and the plot is engaging, especially in the Hunger Games. And when it comes to propaganda, the major thing is kind of seeing how the games actually happened and the motivations that the tributes actually had with one another, versus how the Capitol edited everything to make it seem like something else, to, fit their own agenda. And, that obviously is something interesting and important. I actually think it'll work better on screen in the adaptation that's in the works, because we'll get to see it for ourselves, the differences, rather than Haymitch narrating it to us. Like, well, this is what they changed. They did this instead of that, and this instead of that. So I could ramble on and on about this. I could talk about, the fascist slogans that they had in District 12, like no peacekeepers, no peace, no Hunger Games, no peace, which actually remind me personally a little bit more of the Antifa-like slogan in modern times, like no justice, no peace. So I don't know. I mean, there could have been a way that we could have talked about the propaganda and the narratives that District 12 tell themselves, especially with their music, which, continues to be a huge part of this book. And it, in fact, distills and tells a specific narrative that might, flatten a more complicated truth. And that is a fascinating part of going into, this story as well after the last prequel, because we get to see where... So now we're getting to see like an arc of history for the Capitol. We saw them like 10 years after the Dark Days, when they're still very much, trying to put themselves back together. And there's a lot of really visceral, trauma from the war. And then we see the same in the districts. Similarly, they're like barely holding together, and they still have these old associations, like the Covey still remembers what it was like to not be constrained to 12, and they have this sort of society that I feel like has been a little distilled by this point in this book, 40 years later. And then in the Capitol, we're 40 years later, and the generation that remembers the war and the suffering they went through is dying out. And so now the propaganda machine has to change to, convince the next generation of Capitol citizens that, the Hunger Games is something that they want, and that their relationship with the districts is, just. So that stuff is the most fascinating to me. And again, I did enjoy the characters. I am rambling on and on, but I do feel like, the things that really made the earlier books absolutely transcendent for me in terms of themes and characterization just weren't all the way there for me in this one. And the final book I'll talk about, hopefully I won't run out of battery, is The Anatomy of Exile by Zeeva Bukai. This is another anticipated 2024 release for me, like the last book as well. And this one I got signed by the author at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. This is about an Israeli family between the wars of 1967 and 1973. And so it was interesting to read this one too, kind of with the Hunger Games book, because we're talking about an entrenched conflict and narratives that shift. We start the book, in fact, Tamar is our main character, and her sister-in-law Hadass is a Mizrahi Jew. Her family came from Damascus. The Jews of Syria were largely just forced out or had to leave. And they settled in what was a Muslim Palestinian village that had, been evicted during the 1948 war. And she starts a romance with a Palestinian man who had once lived in that village. And so that's sort of the generation of then. And they're both expelled people, and they hate the idea of borders, and they come from similar backgrounds because they both lived in Arab countries. And anyway, their story ends tragically with him killing her and himself. And that sends Tamar's husband Salim into a backspin because he no longer feels like he could stay in Israel with his sister dead. So they move their family to the United States, for the next several years. He's trying to chase the American dream. Meanwhile, his daughter falls in love with a Palestinian who moves into the same building. And Tamar is thrown into her own tailspin about, what if history will repeat itself? And there is so much in here about differing ethnic ties, like the Mizrahi Jews, who are kind of separate from the Arabs, but also have similar cultural ties to the Arabs. And then Tamar, who is an Ashkenazi Jew, who grew up in Tel Aviv, but her parents were refugees from World War II in Poland, and how people do and don't fit together. And all of that is very much described in this book. And then it does culminate, it feels like maybe a second generation when the 1948 generation is dying out. Then we have the reality of the 67 war and bringing the West Bank in under occupation, and how that inculcates a more fierce Palestinian identity. And so how that continues to shape narratives and kind of keep people apart, even if some Jews and Palestinians might want to find common ground or fall in love. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this book, and I found it very thoughtful and moving. And that about covers it for me. I can only hope I'm talking to a live camera right now as I wrap things up. I will be back on this channel for my page 112 tag, which I've already filmed because I get so excited about that TBR game, so stay tuned for that. And I hope you all enjoyed your own July reading and are also enjoying your August reading as we continue on into it. And thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.